I'm very pleased to welcome Kyle Matthews. He's the Executive Director of the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies, or MIGS, at Concordia University. Full disclosure, I'm a digital fellow there, and he's going to walk us through exactly what the heck is going on. So, Kyle, thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for having me on, Phil.
Okay, let's start with the easy question, Kyle. As the head of MIGS at Concordia University and somebody who's been looking at this issue for quite some time, what do you understand by the word genocide? What does it mean to you?
Well, I look at genocide and I look at it not as a word, but as an international law. The 1948 Convention on the Punishment and Prevention of the Crime of Genocide was the first human rights law signed at the UN, and that it's pretty clear. It details what the crime of genocide is, and so I think if anyone that wants to understand what is genocide, one has to go to look at that. It's available. It's very short, 2 pages. It outlines all these principles that the governments that have endorsed it or are signatories of what the crime is. Canada's a signatory, China's a signatory, and it states quite clearly it has to show the some intent of a government or a non-government entity, like we saw, like ISIS committing genocide against Yazidis in Iraq. It doesn't only have to be governments, but that there has to be an intent to destroy whole or in part. And where I see a lot of I get like shoddy thinking or whatever is that a lot of people say it's not genocide because there isn't mass killing of people. People tend to think of the Holocaust of 6 million European Jews that were killed in industrial like fashion, or mass killings, dead bodies, and say that only genocide can encompass mass killing. But the Genocide Convention says actually no, there's a whole set of other acts. So sterilizing, preventing births within one group is a form of genocide. That's happened to the Uyghurs. Of separating when one group takes children from the other group and moves it to another group. That's a form of genocide. And we've had that cases with the Uyghurs where there have been children taken away and put with Han Chinese family or put in orphanages. So you have to look at the Genocide Convention, and that's where we have to go first to understand what the crime is and how it's seen by states who have signed on to this convention.
I did look at the definition when I saw the parliamentary vote in Canada because I wanted to understand better what exactly these MPs had voted for. I must admit, I was quite surprised at the breadth of the definition. I too thought that genocide as a term in the English language had to involve actual murder. As you said, the convention was adopted in the aftermath of World War II. We all know the Holocaust was a genocide. Do you think back then, looking back, I don't know if you can answer this question, Kyle, but was that rather far thinking of the recent founders of the United Nations to look at a term, a genocide, in the wake of this horrendous mass killing of European Jews, and to expand it in such a way that in the future it would apply to cases where it was not just murder, but as you said, sterilization, forced disappearances, forced separations? That was actually quite forward thinking to the UN body at the time, wasn't it?
It was forward thinking, but one has to look at like who was the mastermind of trying to get this passed as law, and it wasn't actually just the UN. It was Raphael Lemkin. He was a Polish intellectual, a Polish Jew who, before the Holocaust, studied cases of what he saw as genocide of the Armenians, going back in ancient history of cases. So it really was Raphael Lemkin that helped develop this, and through a determination as an individual who spoke multiple languages, that would lobby governments nonstop to get them to sign on. I mean, the first, I think, most surprising thing I learned about Lemkin was the first country that agreed to his definition and support it was Saudi Arabia. It wasn't a Western European state.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was Saudi Arabia. But he saw it wider than just mass killing. That it's true. Mass killing, one thinks it's the worst form, but in order to, the convention is on the prevention and punishment. So it has 2 angles. One, it's to punish those responsible after the fact or after the genocide started, but it's also prevention. So it's to prevent it before it goes to mass killing. And the point is that some governments have played with this and have tried to destroy a group, mass brainwashing, destroying cultural heritage, to bring about the destruction, the cultural destruction of this group. So it was forward thinking, um, but it also is based on longer term historical analysis of what this
Mm.
crime was before the Genocide Convention came into being.
Right. So, if you could maybe walk my listeners through, Kyle, I think when we think of genocide, always we think of the Holocaust. We would think of what happened in Rwanda in '94 with the Hutus and the Tutsis. Probably fewer of my listeners are aware of the Armenian accusations of genocide against the Ottoman Empire in 1950, 1960. Of course, Turkey to this day denies that anything happened. So, what are some other historical, large scale genocides in the ways you just explained it that people probably aren't as aware of?
Well, so one example is looking at the Canadian experience of Indigenous people.
Mm,
We have this massive debate about, and Prime Minister Trudeau did admit after the murder of missing Indigenous that what he thought, that there was genocide, and so in the case of Canada, one could say that, separating children from their families, into
mm,
residential schools was a form of genocide. We have cases where we have smaller groups that have had government has prevented births within group. That doesn't take place during periods of
mm,
conflict. We do have most large
mm,
scale mass atrocity crimes, of which genocide is one of them. A lot of the large scale genocides have taken place within some kind of form of conflict. It provides a cover. We saw that in Rwanda. We saw that in Darfur.
mm,
We saw the cases in
mhm,
Myanmar. But there are other cases where
mhm,
where yeah, it doesn't meet the threshold of armed conflict where there are soldiers killing people en masse. But we do have other examples from history and our own where we can say that other measures were used in order to destroy the group, destroy their culture, prevent births. So yeah, that's
mhm.
what we're struggling with, and I think it's just in the last little while that people are really waking up to this realization.
Mm. So, speaking of difficulties in dealing with genocide, of course, is the other side of the ledger is that states will deny, they will reject the accusations. China's doing this in Xinjiang. Of course, as I said, the Ottoman Empire and the Turks to this day. I mean, Erdogan still denies what had happened in World War One, and I still think the estimates of numbers of dead are in the high hundreds of thousands, if not in the millions. And I don't think we'll ever get a full answer to that. Of course, what Myanmar is doing against the Rohingya Muslims in the northwest Rakhine province, they're denying that as well. So, we have the convention, we have signatories of which, so for example, China has a signatory of the convention, and yet it basically says, piss off. What we're doing in Xinjiang is not genocide. What does that then do to the ability to pursue, either from an international legal perspective or merely a public, I don't know, opprobrium or a public denouncement of what states are doing, if they're going to say, you know what, get lost. We don't think it's genocide, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah, well, this is the truth. Whenever, in most cases, when genocide is committed, governments tend to hide it. The
Mm,
only the only case where I saw recent genocide that showed it was ISIS when they killed Yazidis
mm.
or other infidels. They would broadcast that, put it on
Well,
videos,
they
and
were proud of
showcase.
it. They were proud of the fact. They were proud of the fact.
They were proud of it, but generally governments really hide it and they deny it and they go to great lengths, and we've seen that. I just received an email this morning, from a story that in which, the Chinese state-run media has been uh, buying advertisement on Facebook to promote
Yeah,
basically what's called disinformation of what's happening
yeah.
to the Uyghurs, but a form of genocide denial. So they're putting enormous resources into denying it. They're preventing journalists from entering to that part of China, or the calls by the
Mm,
International Committee of the Red Cross to be able to visit. So if there was nothing to hide, one would think that the authorities
yeah.
would not deny anyone access, but they are. Now, how do you move beyond that? It's very challenging. We don't have the best record, the international community, of actually preventing and punishing people for the crime of genocide. Uh, we know the wars in the Balkans. Genocide against
Hmm.
Muslim Bosnians is a case. Even with peacekeepers close by, they couldn't end it.
Right.
We had the case of Rwanda, where a peacekeeping force could not end it.
Hmm.
So we've tried to
Right.
create, on top of genocide convention, something called the responsibility to protect, an agreement that countries
Right. RTP.
that
Yep.
will not or cannot protect their civilians from genocide and other atrocity crimes. then the international community has a role to get in there. But it's how do you deal with China, a country that is authoritarian, that has absolutely it doesn't necessarily care about its own citizens, so it's not going to care much about what Canada
Right.
says.
Right.
So that gets to a really
Right.
difficult point. What policy levers are there that can be used to change China's behavior? One is, kind of naming and
Hmm.
shaming, and you see more calls to
Hmm.
relocate the Beijing Olympics, and
Hmm.
that was tied into the genocide
Yes.
agreement yesterday at Parliament. We hear talk about Magnitsky sanctions to impose sanctions against individuals who are
Yep.
responsible. And then there's also looking at the economic side of this, where there's
Yeah, I
more
was gonna say
calls to look at
economic
supply
sanctions. Yeah.
chains and slave labor in the part of China where Uyghurs are being mistreated.
Mm.
So these are kind of the options available. They're not perfect, and dealing with a government like China, it's we need a really coalition of states that are going to be together on this, because one country alone will not be able to do it.
Well, and there's no question that when it comes to China and its attitude towards others, we're seeing this here, of course, in Canada. I mean, I had an op-ed piece that came out last week in the Ottawa Citizen Post media about the fact that China is exerting all kinds of influence within corporations in here, and probably stealing technology and information that we want to protect, and yet the government doesn't seem to be doing a lot about it. That's a whole other issue. But I should also point out for my listeners' sake, Kyle, that of course Romeo Dallaire, who was a Canadian who was in Rwanda in '94 and is now part of Meigs Institute. In fact, I believe he's a founding member, if memory serves me correct. Somebody who witnessed that under sort of the whole responsibility to protect the R2P back in '94. So the other thing which I find, which people don't know enough about, it's getting out there a little bit, and you and I know this firsthand because you and I have talked to Uyghur Canadians who have have had pressure put on them, probably by Chinese government agents, to basically shut up, do not talk about what's happening in Uyghur. Of course, family back home are threatened, or said if you do not cease in spreading this disinformation, it might go badly for your family back home. This is maybe an unfair question, but do you know how rampant, how wide that kind of activity is by China to exert influence on expats? They do the same with the Tibetans, by the way. We saw that at I think it was McMaster University a couple of years ago. How widespread is this Chinese activity, as far as you've been able to determine as the executive director of MIGS?
Well, I think it's pretty. I mean, I've spoken to a lot of Uyghurs who have said that they feel pressure. They receive, phone calls from numbers in Canada
Yeah.
threatening them. They receive emails. They feel that they're being tracked. The Uyghur community in Canada is quite small. It's in the couple thousands. It's not a massive group,
Hmm.
but they do. In speaking to their leaders, they do feel they're under pressure, and they are put under pressure. And my colleagues and I, we hosted Dolkan Issa, who's the leader of the World Uyghur
Hmm.
Congress. He came to Canada, and we came under pressure from the Chinese Consul General in Montreal. He wrote to me personally saying, "You
I
can't
bet.
host this
I
terrorist."
bet.
Then put pressure. Then
Yeah.
the Chinese consulate put pressure on the mayor of Montreal's office, and
Yeah.
so they're putting pressure on us. We've seen them put pressure on other Uyghur Canadian speakers at universities, including McMaster. It's become so bad
Hmm.
generally that Human Rights Watch has launched an initiative about the influence of
Oh.
the Chinese government to influence universities and pressure universities not to talk about anything related to human rights. So they put up a project where they're trying to get universities across North America to join their initiative to stand together on this. So it's a pretty big issue, and it ties into not just the Uyghurs but the Tibetans. Some people working for the Freedom for Hong Kong
Yeah.
movement, the Falun Gong,
Yes.
and just general Chinese
Yes.
dissidents in general. Who I've done events and they've been cyber bombed
Hmm.
on our events, or had
Right.
their computer kind of hacked so they couldn't speak. So this says something that the Chinese authorities feel the need, despite it's all lies and nothing's happening,
Hmm.
but they feel the need to deploy either loyal servants of the Z regime, or they have their own spies that are doing this and harassing
Right.
Canadians of Chinese descent that are speaking out, and there has been pressure on families. That's recorded. It's well documented.
Right. It's funny because you say the consul general would say, don't host that terrorist. This is a classic move by a government who basically says, we're going to label somebody a terrorist, and therefore we're going to try to get on the side of right here. And they all do it. China does it. Turkey does it against the Gulenists. I mean, I've seen some reporting, and I've tweeted out last little while. The word terrorism is being used to describe all kinds of things that are not terrorist in nature, and it's highly ironic in the sense that China did have a case that there actually were cases of Uyghur terrorism in the People's Republic of China. There were some pretty significant attacks in metro stations in various parts of China. Had they played their cards right, they actually would have gotten some sympathy, I think, from the international community in trying to identify the very, very small numbers of Uyghur Muslims who had turned to terrorism. It is a very, very minute number, as terrorism just tends to be. But by labeling the entire population a terrorist population, and then by taking the measures it has with the concentration camps and the sterilization, everything else that you talked about, it essentially has lost any support it may have hoped to gain. And of course, now it's trying to do so by applying pressure on families and that kind of thing. So let's turn to the vote in Parliament, Kyle. So we had the
Yeah.
Parliament voted, I believe, unanimously, although there was a lot of people are commenting on this. A lot of Liberal cabinet ministers weren't at the vote yesterday, which raises all kinds of questions as to, did they all have the same meeting? Did they all have the same, 24-hour bug? There were an awful lot of Liberals that were in Parliament when the vote took place. Was this the right move by the Parliament of Canada? And more importantly, and maybe you know this better than I do, what weight does a parliamentary vote have? First of all, with Canadians, and secondly, a parliamentary vote, does it put pressure on the Liberal government of Justin Trudeau to do more with that? So, first of all, was it the right vote, and what will the impact of that vote be?
Yeah. So I listen. Parliamentarians have the right and the ability to speak out on any issue. The role of legislators is to hold the executive branch of government to account, to
Right.
uphold the laws that it signs. So in this case, they made a proclamation that it's what's happening against the Uyghurs or genocide. They did the statement. I'm okay with that. I think it's the correct assessment, and I think it will also give or empower other legislatures across the world to do the same. And I think this is the one thing that
Hmm.
we need to see right now. It's starting to put pressure on China. China doesn't, it's carrying out these terrible crimes, but is also trying to hide them, and also wants to bask with the Olympics coming up. So I think by adding on also that
Right.
the Olympics should be moved, I think that is correct. What the impact will be, it's too
So,
early
so,
to
so
say.
Canada. So we're a bit of a trendsetter in terms of our Canadian Parliament is one of the first to do this, and you think that will put pressure on other parliaments and other legislatures around
Well,
the world?
we are the first parliament. I mean, the subcommittee recognized it. The subcommittee on human rights was the first parliamentary kind of notion, but this really is it's the first
Wow.
Western parliament legislator to do so. So that's historical.
Cool.
The reason I think it
Cool.
happened though is that there's a whole confluence of different things coming together regarding China. There's the anger about COVID, about China lying about the outbreak, stemming
Mm-hmm.
international
Right.
investigation. There are the two Michaels that have been locked up that Canadians are generally like fed up
Yes.
about this. So
Yep.
there's a all these things are coming together to basically have more people angered at what China is behaving
Mm-hmm.
as a in general across the world, and its threats to democracy, human rights, and so forth. So that explains the
Mm-hmm.
wider context. What it will do for the Liberal government, yeah, I'm somewhat frustrated that more or the cabinet ministers didn't vote; they abstained. I think there's a
Yeah.
lot of criticism online right now. If you want just us to go on and go onto Twitter and look
Yeah.
at genocide in Canada, and there's a lot of people, attacking the Liberals or the Prime Minister. I understand they're in a tight spot, and I understand Canada.
Right.
We're 37 million people. We're not alone going to be able to change China's behavior. We can't even
Yes.
get our two Michaels released, so it's difficult. But I do think it does send a
Right.
message, and the one thing that China does through all of its propaganda, its disinformation campaign. It wants to portray China as this glorious paradise. Everyone's happy, and the peaceful
Yes.
rise of China cannot be fought. It's all positive. And what we're seeing is that there's a real dark side to this, an extremely dark side where 1 to 2
Right.
million Muslims are being locked up and going
Yeah.
through almost something like Clockwork Orange. Mass cultural
Yeah. Yeah.
destruction of their group.
Yeah.
It is
Yes.
troubling. So I'm glad that some of the MPs did stand up.
I'm glad you did point out, though, Kyle, that, I mean, the Liberal government is in a bit of a pickle. They know that the two Michaels, so Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, as you said, have been incarcerated for over 2 years now. This is, of course, in conjunction with the arrest of the chief financial officer, Meng Wanzhou, of Huawei in Vancouver in December of 2018. And so the government is trying, obviously, to effect the release of the two Michaels. And if they were to come out really, really strongly, the PRSA may say, you know what, screw you, the Michaels are never getting out. And so, I mean, they are juggling, I think, several balls simultaneously. This does not, I think, exonerate the Trudeau government from taking more action. And of course, you also saw that the CSIS director came out quite blatantly 10 days ago and said that, you know, China is doing X, Y, or Z. And that's what my op-ed with Peace was all about. Lastly, Kyle, maybe if you could sort of share with my listeners, what is the role of MIGS, the Montreal Institute for Genocide Studies at Concordia? What kind of programs are you involved in? And how are you taking the initiative to educate Canadians on the grander notion of genocide and what Canadians can do about it?
Yeah, so at MIGS, I mean, we're a university-based think tank, so we interact and engage on a multitude of human rights issues, but genocide and mass atrocities is a key part of our work. So we are partnered with the Canadian All Parliamentary Group for the Prevention of Genocide. We work with MPs to inform them of what's happening, to bring in experts. We work with the UN Office for the Prevention of Genocide. We do a lot of public-facing
Wow.
events. We just did a major event with Erwin Kotler, who was one of the most prominent voices
Oh,
in
okay.
calling genocide. So we do a lot of public
Right.
events on the case of the Uyghurs. We just had a major conference that's online with some of the top experts in the world on the Uyghur on the Uyghurs and the Uyghur genocide. We write op-eds, we do media interviews.
Mm-hmm.
We're part of a couple different coalitions. We do a lot of high-level advocacy. So recently we were one of the 180 human rights groups that signed an open letter calling for the Olympic Committee not to hold the Olympics in Beijing, thinking it would be a stain on human rights. We've
Mm-hmm.
recently also joined other human rights groups where we signed an open letter to the leaders of the European Union to criticize their free trade deal with China and saying that, you know, you've got to be careful because human rights are being misused. So we're engaged in a lot of that, you know, and sometimes we also do a lot of kind of closed door briefings with experts
Right.
to kind of
Right.
just to help them understand what's happening. So and then speak to the media and just kind of raise awareness. That's kind of our three or four areas
Mm-hmm.
of advocacy,
Mm-hmm.
meeting with policymakers, and informing the wider Canadian and international public about what's happening.
Well, in fact, you and I went to Parliament a couple of years ago when the 2019 Global Terrorism Index report came out. We had an individual from Belgium who came to basically launch that, and we went to Parliament Hill to essentially try to do that. So, Kyle, you know, I tip my hat to you as executive director of MIGS and the staff that you have. I've certainly have attended a number of events in the past. You're doing amazingly well in terms of your, I think, public advocacy and your public information program. So, kudos to you and the team, and I wish you every success in continuing to do this, because this is a really important message that, you know, Canadians simply aren't getting enough, and they are dealing with misinformation, and we all know that states like China and Russia are pulling out all the stops to try to confuse people as to what is really happening, what is not happening, and I think it's you know, it's important that voices such as yourselves at MIGS are, you know, cutting through all that crap and putting the bare facts out there. So, you know, on behalf of Canadians, if I can do that, I just want to say thanks to Migs for all the work that you do.
Thanks. It's always nice. You know, we're working on a shoestring budget, but bringing information to the wider public and with high level decision makers. So to hear our work recognized, it's always appreciated. Thank you, Phil.
Well, I'm certainly going to be putting this out to a huge social media audience once it's processed. So again, thanks, Kyle.
Thanks. All the best.
So that was a conversation with Kyle Matthews of the Montreal Institute for Genocide Studies at Concordia. What do you think? What do you think of Canadian Parliament's move to label the what's happening to Uyghurs in Xinjiang province of genocide? You can reach me on email, borealisrisk@gmail.com, or on Twitter at borealissaves. You also find me on LinkedIn and on Facebook. If you like the content, want to get more, you can subscribe. Go to the website, borealisthreatandrisk.com. Hit the subscribe button. You get a free daily digest, all the blogs and podcasts and interviews. Love to hear what you think about this podcast and others. Also, there's a link on my website for my new book, A History of Terrorism in Canada, called The Peaceable Kingdom. I'll talk to you again soon. Until then, stay safe.